So everybody, welcome to our webinar, A Billion-Dollar Buyout with the Council of Canadians. I'm Sujatha Day. I am the trade campaigner for the Council of Canadians. First of all, some technical things that I'll repeat. This is going to be broadcast live also on Facebook, so and on the web, so you'll be able to access this afterwards. I just wanted to give you some technical stuff. Again, I'll repeat it's very important that you enable the chat function, and so to do that you go to the bottom of the video, and there you'll see a bar pop up, and then almost to the center right there is a little bubble that says chat. So if you can enable that chat function, then you'll be able to participate with us. If ever there's a problem within this webinar, you can email me, sdey@canadians.org. So that's sdey@canadians.org. It's also been put in the chat function in case there's a problem. Also, the Zoom technical support is 1-888-799-5926. So if ever there's a problem that I can't handle, that's where you need to go. So I would just like to acknowledge that while this webinar is virtual, I am located in unceded Indigenous lands, as are many of you. The Kanehakahaka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which I am today. Teotihuacan, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. And I am very happy to introduce Gordon Laxer, who is the author of Billion-Dollar Buyout. To just a little bit about Gordon, if you haven't met him, he is one of our first board members of the Council of Canadians and was here since the founding of the Council of Canadians. He's also the founder of the Parkland Institute and its former director, has done amazing work on renewable energy, about transition. He's the author of After the Sands, about just that, transitioning from tar sands to renewables. He's a prolific author. He's professor emeritus at the University of Alberta, and he's in Alberta, which is, of course, the belly of the beast. And just to also mention that last year, around this time, Gordon Laxer was speaking about energy proportionality and the clause in NAFTA that forces us to export energy to the US. And I'm happy to say that because of Gordon's work and a lot of people at the Council of Canadians and Allies, this is no longer in the new agreement that is still is not ratified yet. And I just wanted to also mention that his information can be found on his report, and an accompanying video, which I encourage you to share, can be available at canadians.org /billion_dollar_buyout. But I'm sure you can find it also on our front page of the Council of Canadians. So with that, I'll take it away, Gordon.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for joining us from wherever you are. Last week, the Trudeau government made the disastrous decision to expand the Trans Mountain oil pipeline from Alberta to the Vancouver area. It makes no economic or environmental sense. To pay off the expansion's capital costs, the line will have to be kept full of bitumen, that's tar sands oil, for 20 or 30 years in order to pay it off. And that would take us to mid-century. And the IPCC says we should be off all fossil fuels, and especially the most highest emitting ones by that point. The battle on the Trans Mountain oil pipeline expansion is not over. The issue is going to be front and center in the next federal election. Let me back up, though, and look at the current political moment that we're in. Debates on pipelines and Alberta sands are part of a much wider debate on the contest. Do we treat climate change as just one of the many issues in an election campaign or in public issues we should be debating, or is it an overarching threat that imperils all humanity and other living things. 16-year-old Swedish activist Greta Thunberg says, treat climate change like your house is on fire, because it is. Sometimes the young are wiser than their parents and grandparents. We live in a very polarized political moment. It's full of both peril and hope. We know the frightening perils. White racist autocrats winning power in Hungary, Italy, the US, and elsewhere, and allying with dictators and autocrats in Russia, India, Turkey, and Brazil. On the other side, we have brave high school kids who have held a series of climate strikes in over 100 countries. They urge adults to join them in a worldwide strike of action for the climate in the week of September the 20th. There's also an extinction rebellion, started in Britain, but also spread to Australia, Canada, Ireland, Sweden, Germany, Colombia, New Zealand, and the US. Protesters in Britain blocked the bridges and area around Parliament and pressured the UK government to take a stronger action on climate. We've seen a groundswell of support for a Green New Deal, starting in the US, sparked by the youth-led Sunrise Movement, and inspiring very much by the inspiring and so articulate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The green idea of the Green New Deal is spread to Canada and to other countries. There are calls for an international Green New Deal by socialist Greece's former finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis. Green parties are enjoying a surge of support in Europe and in Canada, and their rise pressures other parties to take climate action seriously. On the other side, we see the election of conservative governments in Ontario, Alberta, and other provinces, and they're rolling back very modest climate plans. Andrew Scheer's Conservatives stand a good chance of winning Ontario's election. The debate that we've seen in Canada so far on climate is the Liberals say, you know, we actually have a 30-foot tsunami coming at us with climate change. The Liberals talk about putting up a 4-inch wall with their very modest carbon tax, and the Conservatives basically are advocating no wall at all. Well, in a polarized time, it means the political middle falls away. Starker choices are offered, and politics becomes more polarized in times of extreme income inequality. That's when you get polarized politics, like we have now. And it means that it's been raising up the popularity of the populist and racist right, but also the popularity of the left, Democratic Socialist, Bernie Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez in the US, Jeremy Corbyn, and Momentum in Britain. Will Canada follow our English-speaking counterparts? And Quebec, of course, is crucial and showing signs of climate action with massive marches and support. Polarized politics presents great opportunities as well as perils. There are great opportunities for far-reaching climate action. The left and the progressives and environmentalists can make the greatest gains during such times, because polarization is when the system becomes unstuck, when it's more malleable. Changes can happen. My parents came of political age in the 1930s in resistance to the rise of the fascists and the Nazis. And there were also times of hope and positive change as well. You saw the New Deal won with Roosevelt in the US, and the Democratic Socialists won in the Nordic countries. In Canada, we saw during a very polarized time the beginnings of universal social programs, the rise of industrial unions, and the formation of the CCF, the forerunner of the NDP who championed Medicare. The 1960s was a polarized time. This is when I became of political age. It's also when we won the greatest gains in Canada in many ways. In the fight for Medicare, we got the Canada Pension Plan, mass attendance at universities, and many other social and political gains. As we enter the 2020s, we are seeing a polarized politics once again. It is the time, this is a period of high income inequality. Will hope or peril win in this time? If we work hard enough, it could be a period of great opportunity for climate justice. It could be a period of learning to live much more in tune with nature. And we have a contest with the political right. Some people advocate that let's take a mild version to combat the autocratic right. I don't think that kind of strategy will work. We have to be bold and say what we stand for. This is our vision. This is our love story of what we as the alternative. We have to be bold. Buckminster Fuller, the U.S. Architect, said, "You never change things by fighting against the existing reality. To change something, build a new model and makes the old model obsolete." Well, is that new model the Green New Deal, the LEAP Manifesto, eco-socialism, or what? Well, we know that climate upheaval is real and here. Forest fires rage over large areas every summer. Almost every year, cities face floods that were once in a century. Glaciers and mammoth ice sheets rapidly melt. Devastating cyclones, hurricanes, and floods, like the one that hit Mozambique in April, are much more frequent. Science and indigenous teachings tell us climate catastrophes will get much worse unless we act. Well, pipelines used to be thought of merely as pedestrian ways to convey oil and natural gas. No longer. Now, every proposed pipeline conveys controversy. And you may wonder why. Well, as hewers of wood and diggers of oil, Canadians carry on resource exporting, and still, can we do that and still get to a net zero emissions future? Can we have a lighter footprint on the Earth? Is it going to be business as usual, or does the imminent threat of climate change disasters and the Earth's 6 great species extinction change everything, including how Canadians make a living? I'm going to show my web page here, my PowerPoint. I hope everybody is seeing this. Okay, the first thing is we heard last week that the Trudeau government has gone ahead with the TMX, that's the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. Is it going to lead to Canada's clean energy transition to help finance that? Well, the claim is, Trudeau said last week, every dollar the federal government earns from this project will be invested in Canada's clean energy transition. And he also said that the annual revenue could be $500 million after the expansion is completed. Well, it's interesting that last year,
Hi, I'm Gordon.
last fall,
I just interrupting because no one, the PowerPoint isn't being shared. I don't know if you shared it or not yet.
Okay, well, just a minute. How do I?
So go to the bottom and then you go to share, and then.
Just a second. Okay, and
yes,
how
share.
do I get it up?
So you press share, and then after that, it should. What does it say on your screen?
Share screen, desktop 1.
Share screen, desktop one, yep. And click on this on the screen. There's a picture of the little screen that you want to share. So click on that. There you go. This is good. Yes.
Really?
Yes.
This
Yes.
has come up?
Yeah, that was coming up. Just put it to full screen, and then we'll see yeah. Restart the presentation. There we go.
Yes, okay. Good. This is what I was quoting, yes. Trudeau last September said that in an interview, the Trans Mountain Pipeline the intention is not to make a profit, but to reach markets beyond the U.S. And when the whole pipeline was being bought by the Canadian government, it was also negotiating the three North American countries were negotiating the USMCA, the new NAFTA. And Ottawa put in a special provision, and it got the other countries to agree, so that it could have an exemption, so it could subsidize the Trans Mountain pipeline project. So the idea that Ottawa already knew that it was not only not going to not make a profit from this, but it was going to take a loss. And I'm going to show that later. So the idea, Trudeau's claim he made last week is totally bogus. I want to show you the pipeline. This is the Trans Mountain, existing Trans Mountain pipeline. So it was built in 1954, completed in 1954 from Edmonton to Burnaby, which is in Vancouver, one of the cities in Vancouver area. And it's been bringing oil to British Columbia, but also a spur line to Washington State since for 65 years. So the idea is that this pipeline will be expanded, it will almost triple in capacity along almost pretty well the same route, and that pipeline would then take oil to, the idea is it's supposed to take oil to Asia. I want to show you the pipelines in Canada and the United States right at the moment. So just to give you a very brief pipeline history in Canada, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we mainly built oil and natural gas pipelines on an east-west basis, basically to take Canadian oil and gas to Canadians. Some of them went across northern Ontario. That was the natural gas pipeline. The oil pipelines went south of the Great Lakes, but re-entered Ontario and Sarnia. In the 1980s until 2011, so for those 3 decades, 1980s, 1990s, and the 2000s, the pipelines all went south from Canada to the United States. That was when we were into the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA, the Energy Proportionality Clause, which said that Canada must export basically the majority of its oil and gas to the United States. At the moment, we are exporting 3/4 of our oil and over half of our natural gas to the US. In 2011, we get a new era, the third era of pipelines. This is when President Obama temporarily stopped the Keystone XL pipeline, which ran from Alberta down to the Gulf Coast, or that's the proposed pipeline. And he's put a stop to that. The oil industry in Canada was shocked. And I don't say the Canadian oil industry in Canada, much of which was foreign owned. They figured that as whatever oil that they could produce, the United States would take. And Obama's decision shocked them. And then we start to hear about, let's build a pipeline to a coast. Let's find a coast. It could be on the West Coast, could be in the East Coast, but let's just find a pipeline, a coast, so that we can get beyond the American market. And since that time, the U.S. has increased its oil and gas production and is now the greatest oil producer in the world with fracking and shale oil. And so Canada's main market and Alberta's main market is now its greatest competitor. And the problem for Alberta, for the oil sands, tar sands, is that the American oil is cheaper to produce, has lower emissions, and is closer to the market. So the idea behind the Trans Mountain Pipeline was that they would find other markets. The pipeline really, I want to show you the emissions in Canada, where the emissions come from, because what the Trans Mountain Pipeline will do, it will enable the tar sands, oil sands to expand, and that it will add to Canada's emissions. It's going in the wrong direction. It's certainly not going to help us get to the Paris climate targets. And so most Canadians don't realize this, and no one is really talking about this. Not even the Green Party and the NDP, which I think have the best climate policies, that the greatest source of emissions in Canada actually comes from the production of oil and gas. Most of that, as we saw, was for export. This is the fastest growing and greatest source of emissions in Canada. So in 2017, Environment Canada said 27% of our emissions come from the production of oil and gas. Transportation is 24%. So all forms of transportation, airplanes, cars, trucks, trains, boats, are less than the production of oil and gas. And if you look at buildings and electricity, heavy industry, they're in the 10 to 12% range. So the biggest is oil and gas production. And these figures are likely a great underestimation, because they have relied, the official figures in emissions in Canada rely on the self-reporting of the oil and gas companies. They say, okay, this is Suncor, or this is whatever, this is what our emissions are. Environment Canada did a study recently that flew over a number of tar sands, oil sands projects, and they said that the emissions were underestimated by over 60% by the companies themselves. So if that's true, the production of oil and gas could be somewhere in the high 30s or 40% of Canada's total emissions. Alberta's really has, the tar sands really have no long-term economic or environmental future. They suffer from a superfecta of ills. Each one alone would wound the patient. Taken together, they're fatal. The sands are among the world's most carbon-intensive oil, so that's the first. Second, they produce inferior oil that sells at a discount price. Third, they're amongst the most highest cost to produce in a world awash in cheap oil, cheap conventional oil. Fourth, they are in a remote part of a remote province, landlocked and distant from major refineries and markets. So the idea that building a pipeline is going to save the tar sands is really illusory. It's really a fool's errand. The pipeline will not change the fundamental disadvantage of the oil sands, which is that to bring on a new project in the tar sands, you need $90 a barrel for the price of oil. It's somewhere in the moment around $60 a barrel. Saudi Arabia produces oil for $3 a barrel. New projects, Alberta for $90 a barrel. And a pipeline is not going to change that. I'm going to show you the effect of the production of oil and gas on Canada's emissions and its target to try and, its Paris target, its Copenhagen target. I got this from Barry Saxifrage, who put together these numbers. It's a very credible source. there was a meeting in Copenhagen 10 years ago, and Canada promised, this was when the Harper government was in power, to reduce Canada's emissions by 17% by 2020, so by next year now. And if you take Alberta and Saskatchewan are the provinces where most of the production of oil and gas happens in Canada. If you take those two provinces out of the equation, the other 8 provinces and the territories are meeting the Copenhagen target. They have reduced their emissions just about right on target. But if you add in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and it's not got to do with the driving habits of people in those provinces or having uninsulated homes or wastage, it is from the production of oil and gas that happens in those provinces. So what is happening is that for all of the gains that the rest of Canada, the 8 provinces with 85% of Canada's population, has been wiped out by the emissions gains over those same years by Alberta and Saskatchewan, which have 15% of Canada's population. So this is another graph that shows that the rest of Canada's emissions are down, Alberta and Saskatchewan's are up. Again, it's from the production mainly for export of the oil and gas industry. So if you look at this graph, it shows that the emissions are down in most provinces. Ontario is down by 22%, and some of the Quebec and Nova Scotia are down, New Brunswick as well. But that has been totally counteracted by Saskatchewan, Alberta, especially from the oil sands, which have increased their emissions and wiped out the hard gains that the other rest of Canada has done. So let me show you this one first. The problem is that the governments of Alberta and Saskatchewan at the moment have no intention of limiting the increase in production of oil and gas. If emissions and the oil and gas increases, the production increases, the emissions increase from those 2 provinces, by 2030, they will take up 70%, 69% of Canada's emissions if Canada is to meet its Paris target. So the country is supposed to come down. We promised in Paris in 2015 to reduce our emissions by 30% by 2030. So if we actually did that, and Alberta and Saskatchewan increase their production and their emissions, those 2 provinces with 15% of Canada's population will take up 69% of Canada's emissions. Now, if we bring in the IPCC says actually we've got to go further than that. If we want to avoid climate catastrophe, by 2030 we should be cutting emissions by almost a half. So if we actually in Canada did that, and by the way, our emissions are 3 times our per capita level that it should be. So if Canada hit the IPCC target, Alberta and Saskatchewan would take up 92% of Canada's emissions. That is clearly impossible. So I was talking about the break-even point for the tar sands. So this is, these are new fields. So existing production may be somewhat cheaper, but actually putting in new production, this is the marginal cost that it was in 2014. So the Russian Arctic, in which there isn't a lot of oil being produced there, is the most expensive, but the tar sands in Canada is $90 a barrel. So remember, our international oil price is around $60 a barrel now. And if you look at the bottom of the screen there, Iraq is $6 a barrel, Saudi Arabia is $3 a barrel. So the world is going to be hitting peak oil demand probably within the next 5 or 10 years. Shell Oil and other companies are saying that. that is going to reach peak demand. And when that happens, the price of oil is going to fall a lot. It just takes a few percentage drop in demand, and the price of oil can fall by a third or a half, which would make the tar sands even more uneconomic than it already is, new tar sands projects. We can talk about why do the companies continue to produce there if they're not getting a price that even meets their costs. Basically, it's because if you've a lot of these projects around Fort McMurray were started before the 2014, when the price of oil was well over $100 a barrel. It seemed that it might stay up, and the tar sands seemed to be economic. You could make a profit. It fell very much since 2014. But if you had a project that you put in $5 billion out of your $10 billion, what are you going to do? Just write off the $5 billion, or are you going to finish the project, pump oil, even if you lose money in every barrel? It's still better than losing the whole $5 billion. So I want to look at the question about, we keep hearing about the tar sands is going to, the pipeline expansion will open up new markets in China. Well, that is illusory. If you look at the recent period, the blue line is the price that heavy oil gets on the U.S. Gulf Coast, especially the Texas and Louisiana refineries, and if the black line is the price that gets in the Far East. So China has, why would China take Canadian tar sands oil? It's inferior oil. You have to do a lot more to refine it. It costs more when you refine it. It's got sulfur in it. The world is awash in cheap oil. They can get oil from Saudi Arabia, other parts of the Middle East. So why would they want to get Canadian tar sands oil? The existing Trans Mountain pipeline has been bringing oil to the Vancouver area, and most of that it just goes to BC and Washington. But there have been a few tankers that have left Vancouver Harbor in the last couple of years, and almost 90% of the oil in those tankers have gone to the US, to California, not to China. So the idea that there is this big market in China is probably an illusion. So the premise of the Trans Mountain Oil Pipeline that's going to open up new markets is a faulty. The pipeline expansion is likely to be instead a white elephant that is subsidized by taxpayers. Now, if by some miracle I am wrong in this, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion gets built, gets filled to capacity, finds markets, it would encourage the production of 590,000 barrels a day more of oil from the Alberta sands. And Environment Canada has calculated if that happens, it would add 13 to 15 megatons of carbon pollution per year. And this is when we should be cutting emissions in half in the next 10 years. So the expansion doesn't make environmental sense either. Look at the huge environmental disaster that big oil has left Alberta. So the big oil has been operating in Alberta especially since 1947, the Leduc oil find. There are 450,000 oil and gas wells in Alberta. 155,000 no longer produce, but they're not remediated yet. If you can believe it, in that province, there's 400,000 kilometers of pipelines. And the Alberta Energy Regulator has calculated, that's the government energy regulator, that the oil and gas liabilities, the cleanup costs, are $260 billion to clean them up. That's probably an underestimation, but that's now, if you compare that, so if you look at the tar sands alone, it's 130 billion. So there's some of the cleanup is for conventional oil wells, other kinds of oil wells. Now, if you compare the liability to the 5 biggest sands corporations, Suncor, CNRL, Imperial, Husky, and Cenovus, they are worth 165 billion. So the liabilities are greater than the value of the big 5 biggest oil sands projects. There is a voluntary cleanup plan from the oil companies, and if you can believe it's 1.5 billion compared to 260 billion. So that is less than 1% of what they need. So what the oil companies do is that if they have an oil well that is not producing much, it's no longer economic, they sell it to a small producer who maybe perhaps wants to make a quick buck and hopes to get in the oil industry. That producer goes bankrupt, and then the small producer cannot handle the cleanup costs, and the big oil companies try and get away with avoiding their liabilities. This could be Alberta's actually next boom, which is in the cleaning up, putting Albertans to work to clean up, do the cleanup. We should get the big oil to pay for that. Okay, this is again on whether the Alberta sands are economic. I think this shows that we're in the end game for the Alberta sands. These companies, full pullouts. Statoil of Norway is fully pulled out. Devon from the US, partial pullouts by France's biggest oil company, Total SA, Shell, ConocoPhillips, the Koch brothers, Murphy Oil US have also partly pulled out. And really, Alberta, I think, has 2 choices. One is to carry on and hope that there's going to be market will revive, and they'll be able to carry on as they have, or we can have a managed transition off it. I think if Alberta continues the way it is and hoping for a boom, is going to be a free fall, an unmanaged transition. The big oil companies will pull out, leaving their debt, all of their liabilities. Okay, I want to get into the story of the pipeline, of how the Trudeau government got into this mess. So I want to cast your minds back to October 2015, the time of the federal election. If you remember, going into that election, the Thomas Mulcair's NDP was actually in first place in the polls, but the Liberals catapulted themselves from third place to first place and won a solid majority. Well, 6 weeks after the Trudeau government was elected, the Paris climate summit was held, and the Trudeau government went there, and they figured, well, we have to have a national climate plan, and to have a credible one, we're going to need to bring Alberta on side, because Alberta is the biggest oil producer. It's responsible for 38% of Canada's emissions. So you can't have a climate plan without Alberta. So there was a grand bargain that was struck with the new NDP government. And if you remember, the NDP government had been elected in May of 2015, a few months before the Trudeau government was elected. And there was kind of thinking from the Trudeau government that, this NDP government wouldn't be in big oil's pocket like the Conservative governments in Alberta had been. And so if Alberta comes up with a credible climate plan, we will incorporate that into the Canadian one, and in return, the Ottawa will make sure that a pipeline gets built to a coast. So that's how it got into this. But the the Ottawa-Edmonton alliance was already unraveling when the Liberal government bought the Trans Mountain Corporation. Alberta actually pulled out of the federal climate plan the next day. And of course, the United Conservative Party under Jason Kenney was elected in April. And they promised to declare war. They actually declared war against the climate plan and promised to, well, they got rid of the provincial carbon tax. They said that they will get rid of the cap on emissions from the tar sands, that they will stop the accelerated phase out of coal-fired electricity. And so they even said that they would stop sending oil to BC because it opposes the Trans Mountain expansion, boycott banks that shun fossil fuels, and equalization payments if the pipeline isn't built. Well, in other words, throw a hissy fit. A fat lot of good that will do. Would it make tar sands oil cheaper to produce or suddenly lift the dirty label off the oil sands oil? So, okay, Alberta pulls out of this plan, says we are not going to do our end of the bargain, but the Trudeau governments get stuck with the short end of the stick and saying, we're going to buy this pipeline. And they went ahead with that promise and did it. And it makes no sense to do the expansion. I mean, buying an existing pipeline without the expansion might have made sense, and that might not have been dubious. But to a third of the government bought not only the existing pipeline, but the plans and a little bit of work on the expansion. The total cost was $4.4 billion. A third of that cost was actually for the expansion. And the parliamentary budget officer said that Ottawa paid $1 billion too much for the existing pipeline. So Kinder Morgan had come in last April and said, we're not going to continue with this expansion. And really kind of as an ultimatum, they issued to Ottawa. The Trudeau government said, okay, well, we'll talk to you and we'll try to find a private sector buyer. And the government said, okay, well, we will make a tentative offer to buy the pipeline, but we want to give us 6 weeks for us to find a private sector buyer. They tried, and there was no private sector buyer because the pipeline is highly risky. It is not an economic prospect. So the interesting thing is that the pipeline was there was a court challenge to the pipeline expansion, and the Ottawa did not. In its proposal and its offer for the pipeline, did not have a clause in there saying, if the court case goes against us, we will walk away from this deal. So in August, the Court of Appeal did say that the expansion couldn't go ahead because there hadn't been enough consultations with Indigenous people, and yet 2 weeks later, the Trudeau government went and finalized the purchase. 2 weeks after that, Trudeau is on being interviewed by Paul Wells, Maclean's television interview, and he said, if we had known the pipeline, the court decision, we would have gone ahead with the purchase. Well, that's, I think, far-fetched. Ottawa employs lawyers to look at lots of possibilities, and they should have figured out that this court case could have gone against them. Well, while all of this was happening on the pipeline front, the three NAFTA countries were negotiating a new agreement to replace NAFTA. And so in that agreement, there actually had originally been a chapter on energy, like there had been in NAFTA. And NAFTA had a provision called the Energy Proportionality Clause. It basically only applied to Canada. Mexico said, no, we don't agree to this when they joined NAFTA. Didn't really apply to the United States until recently, because the United States was a massive importer of oil. Basically what it says is that basically the U.S. had first access to the majority of our oil and gas. It is good that that clause is gone. Mexico once again helped save our bacon, because they said we don't want an energy chapter in the USMCA. So instead of an energy chapter, Canada signed a bilateral energy memorandum with the US. It's just between Canada and the US, but it is a fully part of the agreement. One of the provisions in that side letter, energy side letter, is that Canada gets an exemption on the subsidy clause. There's one of the chapters in the USMCA is on state-owned enterprises. We have a long history in Canada of crown corporations, you know, all the way from CBC and Air Canada, and a lot of provincial hydro companies. But the USMCA, this is very much neoliberal corporate kind of language. It calls them state-owned enterprises, and they're not supposed to compete with for-profit companies. But anyways, in that chapter, it basically says that Canada can subsidize, it gets a special exemption to be able to subsidize the Trans Mountain expansion. It also talks about Indigenous ownership. So Ottawa was already contemplating partial Indigenous ownership well over a year ago. At the time it was thinking about buying the pipeline. Well, I think what I'll do at this point is maybe I'll show the animation and then open this up for discussion. I think it is very much, it isn't the kind of purchase that Canada should have done. We should be moving and spending, if we're going to spend that kind of money, we should be spending it on climate plans that really do reduce our emissions and our footprint on the earth. So, Sujata, I wonder if you could put on the animation.
When he was elected, Prime Minister Trudeau promised that Canada would be a climate leader, not a laggard like the Harper government. Environment and Climate Change Minister Catherine McKenna pledged to limit global warming to a 1.5 Celsius rise. But after a little time in office, things changed. Trudeau told Big Oil that no country in the world would leave oil resources in the ground. Most of our oil, 97%, are in the Alberta tar sands. What was that? Experts agree. Renowned NASA scientist James Hansen warned, if the tar sands oil is fully exploited, it's game over for the planet. In 2018, Ottawa bought the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion project after no other investor would buy it. The expansion would triple our exports of tar sands oil on the Trans Mountain line. Pipeline proponents claim the oil will go to China, but the facts say different. China pays less than the US for heavy oil. In 2018, we exported only 0.1% of our oil to Asia. This pipeline expansion doesn't make financial sense. It doesn't make environmental sense either. More tar sands oil means more greenhouse gas emissions, 13 to 15 million more tons of pollution per year. That means more global warming. Scientists have been clear. We have to cut emissions in half to keep under a 1.5 degree temperature rise by 2030. In Canada, the production of oil and natural gas from the tar sands is our largest and fastest growing source of emissions. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion will affect local ecosystems and communities. Tanker traffic in the Burrard Inlet and Gulf Islands will increase sevenfold, threatening southern killer whales. Indigenous communities along the pipeline route will see their ecological security and sovereignty threatened. And guess what? You and I are paying for this pipeline. Taxpayers are on the hook for this financially risky project. Ottawa paid $4.4 billion for the existing line. We could pay $10 billion more for the expansion. In the new NAFTA, Canadian negotiators created a special clause so Ottawa could subsidize the pipeline even more. The Trudeau government also cut a deal with Alberta, a provincial carbon tax and cap on tar sands emissions in exchange for Ottawa supporting the pipeline. But Conservative Alberta Premier Jason Kenney tore up the deal. Canadians should care about the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. As youth climate leader Greta Thunberg said, "There is simply not enough time to wait for us to grow up and become the ones in charge. Unite behind the science, that is our demand." This is Gordon Laxer, Political Economy Professor Emeritus at the University of Alberta. I have researched oil and the environment for decades.
Sujata?
Okay, so this is the end of the presentation. I'm taking it. Okay, so
Yes.
okay, great. So thank you, Gordon, for all the information. We have all these tools now that we can use. We probably have a lot of questions. So at this point, I'm going to take questions. I'm going to try and work with audio. So basically, what I'm going to ask you to do is at the bottom, there's a raise hand command. Let's see, how do we do that? So basically, when you're in the chat, or actually, what we'll do is, can you just in the chat, ask if you have a question, just put it in the chat that you have a question, and then I'll take a speaker's list and I will empower your microphones one by one to ask a question. So if somebody wants to ask a question, just put it in the chat that they want to ask a question. I'm not seeing any questions. From Jose Vaillancourt, she says, "Thank you indeed. If you could share that animated video clip in an email, I would love to share it on social media. Sorry, I have to go now to my next appointment." So I will share the email with everybody. Thanks, Jose, for coming in. Is there any other people? Okay, I have Adrian who has a question and knows how to raise his hand. So he can also tell us how to raise our hand while he answers the question. So I'm letting you talk. I'm going to just give you your microphone. Okay, it should give me, Adrian, you just have to also unmute your microphone yourself too. So I've unmuted you, but you also need to go in next to your name and okay. So Adrian, why don't you ask your question by chat and then I'll repeat it. So while you're getting that ready, I'm going to, there's also Trish who says, "Thanks, that last video is super for sharing. Will we have access to Gordon's PowerPoint?"
Yes, Trish, I would be happy to send it to you. Great to meet you on the weekend. You're from Powell River, aren't you?
Yes. Okay, so the next question is from Adrian. How do we fight big oil?
Well, we have to, I think Canadians are not aware that the biggest source of emissions in Canada is from the production of oil and gas. And I think if they're aware of it, they would be open to taking action. There was a poll done on a Green New Deal amongst Canadians. Would you support a Green New Deal that was about building green infrastructure? 61% of Canadians said yes to that. And then they said, would you agree with the Green New Deal if the rich and the corporations were made to pay? And the increase in the support went up to 66% when they were asked that question. The thing is that we are talking about a carbon tax, and I agree with a carbon tax, a low carbon tax, but you can't put up a carbon tax high enough to do most of the job because we have so much income inequality in Canada. So if you put to half of the emissions in the world are produced by the 10% richest people in the world, and to curb the emissions of the well-to-do and the rich, to stop, maybe flying around halfway around the world for a party, to put up a carbon tax high enough for them, that would stop low-income and middle-income people from even getting necessities like a heated home and getting to work. So we have to look at the supply side too, the production side. See that the carbon tax actually hits ordinary people, and that's why we had the Gilets jaunes rebellion in France. I'm not talking about the racist yellow vests in Canada. I'm talking about the one in France. It shows that if you put up a carbon tax that's too high, it hits ordinary people. I think you would have a lot more popularity if we actually targeted big oil. And of course, we have to. I think Canadians are going to have to do a rethink. We have been, since before Confederation, hewers of wood and diggers of oil. We actually had the first oil well in North America was in Ontario in 1858. So we were digging oil as early as that. We to get to the low carbon or zero carbon future, we're going to have to do something else in the economy, and we're going to have to do it in a way that leaves no one behind, that brings everyone along. So the first thing I think is that we have to show what the role of big oil is doing, and how its investments in the tar sands have no future. And I think we can get support from ordinary people on that. I'm not hearing you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I'm just going, well, thank you. Now, I'm the non-techie here. So basically, I've seen some new attendees, so I just wanted to remind people of the chat function and how to get there. So if you go to the bottom of the video, and you put scroll your cursor there, you will see a black bar comes up, and then if you go to the right-hand side of the center right, there's a thing with a little bubble. There's a chat. That's how you activate your chat, and so that's what we'll be using to take questions. And I noticed too that there's somebody on the phone. Unfortunately, phone people cannot ask questions on this system. But if you want to email me, in the email that I gave that was sent to all the participants is my email, sdey@canadians.org. I'd be happy to also take your questions that way. And now we have a question from Don Gibberson. I hope I pronounced that right. How do we decarbonize Alberta's economy? Oil accounts for 25% of the province's GDP. Can biofuels, geothermal, renewable energy, etc., replace this in terms of jobs and provincial revenues?
Well, this is a really major problem. how Alberta can move to a post-sands economy. This is something that we should really be having major conversations. I mean, I haven't, as one person, I haven't got all the answers, obviously. There should be communities that all Albertans should get involved in this conversation, because really there is no long-term future in this. I agree that it is a big part of the GDP. It's it's maybe 25% of the GDP. It is not 25% of employment. If you look at the actual the tar sands, about half the production, half the workers there are construction workers. So they figure that when you build a project, that the number of jobs falls to about 10% once the project gets going. So a lot of the jobs are actually in the building of it. So those construction workers could be put to work, should be put to work in doing other things, retrofitting all buildings in Alberta and in other parts of the country, building high-speed trains between Calgary and Edmonton, between Windsor, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Quebec City, building more LRT and subways. There's a lot, and you can actually, there are more jobs it can be saved in preventing the emissions of a carbon atom than in actually digging one up and burning it and emitting it. And those jobs could be at home. Instead of people flying in, flying out to Fort McMurray, you can save carbon emissions in every community. Workers there could be living at home. Now, it isn't all a construction future. You build a high-speed train once, and then it's there. You retrofit all buildings, and it's there. So we have to figure out a longer term what people can do. Now, Albertans are very highly educated. They're very skilled at doing things. A lot of it could be in high tech. It could be in healthcare. It could be in the caring sectors. One of the advantages of all of the caring professions is that they're very low emissions, and we actually need a lot more, especially as the population ages. One of the things that Alberta could be doing is deep geothermal. This is supposed to be of good potential in Alberta. Albertans are great at digging wells. They have a lot of skills in that. That could be one thing that they do. Whether there will be as many jobs as exist in Alberta, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It's going to be a tough thing. But Alberta, Calgary and Edmonton are two fairly large cities that can have a broad economy that can expand, can do lots of other things. And the rural areas, you have agriculture, you have tourism, there are other things that people can do. So it took about 4 decades from the 1920s and the 1960s to develop the technology to make oil from the tar sands. We should be, and a lot of government money went into that, we should be putting the same effort, I hope not the same amount of time, but the same amount of effort going into what would a post tar sands economy look like for Alberta, and it should involve Albertans from all sectors getting involved in this conversation, rather than the conversation of how can we continue to continue with expansion of the tar sands. It is really not viable.
So the question again from Adrian, to piggyback on Don's question, you've answered a bit, but why has Alberta refused to diversify for so long?
Well, Alberta, when Peter Lougheed was elected in 1971, he was talking about the importance of diversifying. Albertans have been talking about this for almost 50 years, and seeing in the 70s and the early 80s, there were attempts to diversify the economy. But we got into neoliberalism. There's quite a difference between the Lougheed conservatives and the Klein conservatives. Lougheed conservatives were into much more government activity to try and go into other sectors, to build some high tech, to make it a medical and healthcare center. Klein was into very much that idea that just let the market determine it, get the government out of the business of business, which is what he talked about. So here is the problem. When oil when it's booming, this is the period. Why should people in business say in Alberta, why should it do anything else? I can make so much money from oil. When there's a bust, there is people want to do something else, but the economy is in bad shape and it's a hard time to do it. It really would. One of the problems is that Albertans believe so much in private enterprise or private sector and not government getting involved in this. Government is going to have to take a lead, along with unions and other people in business, in diversifying the economy.
I'm just going to check. I have Don Giberson who says, sorry, I need to leave for another appointment. Informative, webinar, well done. I just wanted to make sure, can people just, also, I'm hearing that some people are having audio troubles. Can people just in chat tell me how the audio is? Is there any problems with it? Is anybody having... I'll ask, I don't see questions, so I'm going to ask my question. So no problems with audio, very clear, says Trish. So sometimes we don't know whether it's on our end or whether it's on the receiving end. I hear you well. Dr. Laxer's voice was in and out. So his connection to me is good, but if you can just make sure Gordon, that your microphone is, yeah, that'd be great. So please, please tell me in chat if there is any problems with audio. And so maybe I'll ask my question. So is part of the problem in Alberta is that sometimes when a petroleum economy is sort of like a circle, right? Like once you get locked into petroleum economy, it's impossible to leave it, because once you have high wages, so you can't really have a startup because the wages are very high in the sector, and also because your dollar is also really high. So it's hard to, have a manufacturing sector and export. So is it also like the fact that it's kind of like a circle in a way, that the more Alberta goes down the petroleum route, and with trade agreements even it locks it even further, the more they get self-locked in and they can't actually do any other industry because the petroleum industry just changes the financials.
Yes, all of that is true. Very, very good. Alberta made a huge mistake. It actually started off very well in the 70s and 80s. Alberta brought in, under the Lougheed government, brought in the Heritage Fund in 1976, where it decided we will save 30% of all resource revenues, royalties, other kinds of economic rents, and we'll put it in a fund which will then help us get to the post-oil economy. And by the way, Lougheed said, I can foresee an Alberta without oil, but I can't foresee an Alberta without water. So that water is, in fact, Alberta's most important resource. So Alberta started the Heritage Fund in 1976, but by the mid-'80s, when the price of oil went down, it was one of those busts that is periodic in the industry. They instead of raising taxes like in every other province to pay for all the services Albertans get, education, healthcare, all those things, they decided they would stop putting money into the Heritage Fund, and they would take all that resource revenue. So they were dependent on that resource revenue. The Alberta now has $17 billion in its Heritage Fund. Norway actually copied the Alberta example of the Heritage Fund. Norway started almost 20 years later in the mid-90s, and with about the same amount of oil and gas. Norway now has over $1 trillion, over 6. If Alberta had kept growing its
Gordon,
Heritage Fund,
I'm going to have to
it
interrupt you.
would have the money to transfer.
Your connection just went down, so you're going to have to start again from your last 3 sentences. So if Alberta had
So if Alberta had stayed the course with its Heritage Fund, it would be many times larger than it is now. And it could help the transition, help workers retrain to do other things, pay them for while they're retraining, go into new industries, do all of those things when I talk about retrofitting or high-speed trains, all of those things it could be doing if it had that money. But it really allowed all of that to be dissipated. It had some of the lowest royalty rates in the world, lower than even Texas and Wyoming and Alaska in the U.S. Its royalty rates. It's a real tragedy and a travesty that the Alberta, mainly conservative governments, had very low royalty rates. To be nonpartisan here, the NDP, when it had a chance 2 years ago to raise royalties, did not do that, even though they had promised to. So Alberta has been really short-sighted in not saving. The problem is that now that we're at kind of the tail end of the era of the tar sand oil, not at the end of the age of oil fully in the world as a whole, but certainly we're close to the end of tar sands oil. There really is not the royalties. It is too late to be saving all of those funds. But there needs to be, I would like to see a plan where Alberta and Canada get together and talk about a transition so that no one is left behind. So it's a managed transition, not a free fall in Alberta, so that it gets on to a different kind of economy. This should happen in other provinces, in Saskatchewan, Newfoundland with its oil, and other places as well. I can't hear you.
Sorry. I have a few questions that are coming on. Now I've got one from Trish. I have another one from Dawn, and just another comment from Adrian. I'm going to scroll down and get it. And he says, thank you for he or she, I'm not sure. Thank you for the webinar, but I have to go. So I'll start with Trish, and then I'll go to the other questions. So wages are very high, or were. But a new neighbor from Calgary tells me that so are family breakups due to high living, big cars, big boats, big entertainment, and separations due to work obligations away from home. Are there stats on this? And do you want them both at the same time?
Yes. Oh, okay, sure.
And the other one is from Don, and he says, Gordon, have you heard about the green way to fly, bringing back an updated dirigible, i.e. bringing back an updated dirigible with photovoltaic covered wings? I believe an Ontario company is looking into this. There are prototypes at present being used in Burundi.
Okay, on the first question, yes, it is a problem that people, especially in the oil industry, especially up in Fort Mac area, have gotten used to high wages, a lot of the workers. And a lot of the young men, and they mainly were men, didn't go to university or college when the wages were high. They figure, I can make over $100,000 up here. Why do I need to get an education? And it is a real problem. Maybe you did that when you were 20, you're 30 years old now. And if the tar sands starts to phase out and closes down. What do you do? If you're young like that, there should be ways of helping people go back to school so they can carry on. If you're an older worker, maybe in your 50s and 60s, there should be ways of helping you. Maybe you have to get into retirement and get an income there. A lot of people, and there are people who've studied this. Yes, people who have bought big cars, they figure, well, this boom is going on. I'm not going to be saving for the future. It's going to carry on. You buy a house, all of those things. And yes, that can be very hard kind of lifestyle to get off. And yes, there are separations, breakups, marriage, relationships. It's difficult when people do this 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. They're up there with working 12-hour days, long days, and they're there just with their fellow workers. And then they come back home, and and they've been kind of, out of family life. And yes, I'm Sarah Dorow, D-O-R-O-W, who's a sociology professor at the University of Alberta, has been doing studies on the social side of Fort Mac, and she's been helping. And I can, anybody who wants to write me, by the way, and Trish as well, who wanted to find out, I don't know if it's the same Trish, wanted to get my slideshow. My email is glaxer@ualberta.ca, glaxer@ualberta.ca, and I can also send you links to Sarah Dorow and other kind of social impacts of the tar sands industry. Oh, on Don's question. I haven't read a lot about dirigibles and photovoltaics. It could be a great way to do it. I mean, the dirigibles, can carry huge weights and use so much less energy than airplanes. As long as they don't use the helium, of course, that they did in the 30s with Led Zeppelin and those things. It could be especially good in Canada's north, where you get remote communities that don't have roads to them. Dirigibles could be actually taking huge payloads and food. Maybe the cost of food in remote northern communities is very high. But maybe it could be used more generally. But yes, so it sounds promising, but I don't know a lot about it. If you want to share it with people, that's great. I'd be happy to, if you want to email me, to look at what you have on that.
Great. I put your email in the chat box so that everyone can also have it, so they can get that. So I'm going to ask another question. We were talking about popular opinion in Alberta and Saskatchewan about the yellow vests. We also were talking a bit, and we were talking about the war chest, the Kenny war chest to fight it. What do you think is happening? Because we at the council have been getting a lot of emails and trolls and kind of fight back from people who are basically saying that either climate change isn't happening or we really need this industry. So what is happening in Alberta and Saskatchewan? How are they working with public opinion on this, and what can we do here?
Yes, Alberta had this, Albertans and the Saskatchewan very similar, the idea that this was next year country. So both of these provinces have a rural past where people were into farming, and they were optimists. They go through things that they can get flooding or the crop doesn't succeed. But they say next year. So we didn't succeed this year, but next year we will. And they've applied a similar idea to the oil industry. So they've seen the booms and busts and thinking that, okay, you know, we've been in busts before, and this is just going to be, there will be another boom, another rainbow at the end of. But the problem is that's very unrealistic. People, I understand why people have deep-seated attachment to that. It is certainly being fed by the conservative governments in both provinces, by the oil industry, by the media, and there's a lot of popular opinion which supports that. I'm afraid it's very hard to reach out to people when they're in that kind of frame of mind. How do you get off that and say, we've got to do something else? The whole community is saying, and there's a kind of desperation behind it. We've got to get more pipelines built. This will take us out of our problem. We've got to do this or this, you know. How you get people off that, it's going to be a lot of work in talking to people, doing alternatives, saying, no, this is what we can do. The oil industry, especially the tar sands, because it's dirty oil, it's got higher emissions, it's got a huge environmental impact, environmental sacrifice zone in northeastern Alberta, that we have to make sure that we can do the transition and not be left with a liability. The problem with Alberta, I mean, how to convince people is very difficult. My worry is, you know, Alberta started before 1947, before the great Leduc strike of oil just south of Edmonton. Albertans were poor. It was a poor province. It was a have-not province. There's been this oil boom. I'm an historian, so I think of, you know, there's been 7 decades of oil boom. I'm afraid Alberta is going to go back to being a have-not province, but with the addition of having this huge amount of liabilities of a totally messed up, fouled up, environmentally fouled up province. And it is such a beautiful place. I think that there should be a campaign to make sure that the oil companies, the polluters pay, that they pay for the cleanup. This could employ, at least in the short run, lots of Albertans. And they could do it, because a lot of this is conventional oil. It's not, some of it's up in Fort Mac, but a lot of it is through the province. You get these donkeys that, you know, going up and down, doing the pump jacks right throughout the province. People could be working near their home communities in doing that. But there has to be, and I'm involved with a group called the Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Plan, where people are trying to figure out how much are the liabilities and to make sure that the big oil companies pay before they leave the scene entirely. They pay for their cleanup. I'll leave it at that.
I'm not seeing any more questions, so I'm just going to ask a last question. So basically, they've approved the pipeline. We are going into a federal election. There's a number of steps over the summer that are going to happen. So what can we do, and what are we going to expect leading up to the next phase? What can we actually do?
Well, I don't think this fight over the Trans Mountain expansion is over. Certainly the Liberals and the Conservatives federal support it. Both the NDP and the Greens oppose it, and they could hold the balance of power. We don't know what's going to happen in the election. Chantal Hébert wrote a great column a few days ago and said the party that went into the 1988, 1993, and 2015 elections didn't win the election. So being ahead in the polls does not necessarily mean they'll win. The best outcome would be a minority government where the NDP and the Greens hold the balance of power. And if those parties said to whichever government was, and it might be easier to apply this to the Liberals than the Conservatives, but if they said, you know, unless you stop this expansion, we will not support you. So I think there are going to be more court cases. There's going to be much more action. There's going to be more action on the ground. Indigenous people and non-Indigenous environmentalists are going to fight this. Burnaby and the governments of Vancouver and British Columbia are going to fight this. So I don't think it's over yet.
Great. Yes, and I also just want to remind people that we're also working in the Council of Canadians with a bunch of organizations all over Canada on the Green New Deal, and there'll be town halls and trying to come up to have a platform for going into the next election of how we can have a Green New Deal. So I just wanted to thank everybody for the attendees, Gordon Laxer for his amazing research that we have that we can take now into our communities, and to Mohammed Mano, who helped me figure out how this all works. I will be sending everybody a link to the video on Facebook, and also some more information on his report and our website. So thank you very much, everybody, for doing this on a nice spring day. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody.